everybody. In this video, we're going to be looking at the process for dividing integers. And one of the easiest ways to introduce the idea of the division of integers is to remind students that division is just the inverse of multiplication. So if we know that a positive times a positive equals a positive, in this case, positive 3 times positive 4 equals positive 12, well, that tells us that the inverse of that math fact should also include all positives. Like you should have a positive 12 divided by 4 equals 3. And if you have a negative times a negative equaling a positive, then the inverse of that fact would tell you that a positive 12 divided by negative 4 needs to equal negative 3. And if we look at our other multiplication of negative math facts, if we have negative 3 times 4 equals negative 12, well, that tells us that negative 12 divided by 4 needs to equal negative 3. And if we switch where the negative is and we say 3 times negative 4 equals negative 12, well, that means that negative 12 divided by negative 4 needs to equal 3, just because multiplication and division are inverses of each other. And if you look at these patterns, notice that if you have a negative divided by a negative, it equals a positive. And if you have a positive divided by a positive, it equals a positive. So it follows this same rule about if you have the same signs, then the answer is going to be positive, whether it's two positives being divided or if it's two negatives being divided. And similarly, if you have a positive divided by a negative or a negative divided by a positive, if they're opposite signs, then the result will be a negative, just like the rule for multiplication. So if your students have a really solid understanding of how multiplication works and you've used the set models and the number line models to help them understand the rules for multiplication, then the transition to division should be really simple because at this point in their learning, students will also have a clear understanding that multiplication and division are inverses of each other. However, you can still use some set models to represent division. Specifically, if you're dividing by positive numbers, that's usually pretty easy to model. Because if you were to take negative 10 and divide it into 5 groups, well, 10 negatives split up into 5 groups gives you 2 negatives in each group. And so this shows that negative 10 divided by 5 equals negative 2. However, it's a little bit harder to show the process of dividing by a negative number because how do you show that you're splitting them into negative number of groups? Like maybe you could say, oh, I have 6 positives. So I have those 6 positives, and I'm going to divide them into -3 groups. And the negative, switches the sign and it makes them negative. Maybe you could contrive some type of model like that. But an easier way of thinking about it would be to remind the students that whenever you divide by something, you can also multiply by the reciprocal, and the answer is equivalent. And this is something they should be familiar with because I think by the time you introduce negative numbers, they've already done a lot of work with fractions. And so you can introduce the idea of 6 divided by -3 as being the same as 6 times -1/3. And remember, the process for modeling the multiplication by a negative number is that you're going to be taking out essentially a third of a group. And so the way that you would think about this is you would say, okay, I have all of my positive and negative pairs. So start off with a bunch of those. So my starting amount is 0 because all of my positives and negatives are equally balanced. And then I'm going to be taking away a third of a group of +6. So one group of +6 would include all of these numbers and all of these numbers. So this black weird shape that I've drawn here would represent one group of +6. And if I split that up into thirds like this, so here's 1/3, here's another third. Sorry, my drawing's really weird. And my third third. If I split that group of 6 up into thirds, and I take away one of those thirds, so these two positives are gone now, then we can see that the answer is going to be -2 because these two negatives now no longer have positives that they're paired with. And so this can show that 6 divided by -3 equals -2. And again, that uh, or that model can be a little bit confusing because you're like taking away a partial group. But that's the best way that I can think of to model that process of division by negatives. But you can also just remind students that division is the inverse of multiplication. And if they really clearly understand the process for multiplying integers, they will easily be able to realize that the number that you would multiply by -3 to get a +6 has to be a -2. So I hope this video is helpful for dividing integers. And if you have any questions, please let me know.